Today we are talking about some 2021 and 2022 data protection trends and how you can best prepare to protect your data in 2022 based on what we're estimating we'll see in the market. So I am Jonah May from Offsite DataSync, of course, and I'd like to formally give a welcome now to Jason Buffington from Veeam, who's joining me today.
Jonah, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to this. This is a great time of year to be looking at, what's working and what didn't in 2021. And I'm looking forward to sharing some data from a couple different projects that Veeam sponsored and or authored to kind of help folks start planning for, use it or lose it plans for 21 is over, and then what they should be looking forward to in 22.
All right. We'll be referencing a lot the 2021 Data Protection Trends report that Veeam published earlier this year. So on this slide and others throughout the presentation, you'll see this QR code if you want to go ahead and download it. We'll also have it at the very end for you guys. So moving on our agenda today, we're going to be talking about some different BaaS and DRaaS initiatives we've seen in the market, as well as using that opportunity to talk about the data protection report and what Veeam has seen in the market. We're going to be talking some data planning for 2022, how you can prepare your data and your backup solutions for the coming year, and then some ransomware best practices that you just might not know about that could be easy to implement. Jason, I know you've spoken quite extensively on these next couple of slides, so I'm going to let you kind of take over here.
Yeah, that sounds great. So as I mentioned earlier, throughout the year, Veeam does lots of different research projects. And really, by the way, it's always with a third-party research analyst firm. It's always with unbiased respondents. So these are not people that are Veeam customers, or at least we don't, statistically speaking, I guess a portion of them are probably Veeam customers, but we don't know. This actually comes from the Data Protection Trends 2021 report. It is the largest IT industry report on data protection. Nearly 3,000 IT leaders, IT decision makers from 28 different countries around the world. And really all we were looking for were things on what were the drivers, what were the challenges, what are the goals around data protection moving forward. This is arguably one of my favorite slides from that particular set of research, because it asks the one question I think if all of us are thinking about backup and recovery, the question asks, which of the following would drive your organization to change its primary backup solution, right? So what's wrong, right? It'd be like asking somebody, why do you want to trade in your car? Or why do you want a different house? Right here, we're asking what would drive you to change your backup solution. Now, we put a block around this on the top half just to kind of make it a little bit easier to read. It's a little bit of an eye chart. What you see in the purple lines is when respondents could choose all the options they wanted. And then in the orange line, this was what was most important to them. And I think notably what the most common response was qualitatively better backups and recovery, right? So you look on that far right-hand edge at 36%, that longest line, improving RPO, right? So that means reducing data loss, improving RTO, in other words, mitigating downtime. So the most popular response was simply around having what you expect in recovery to do better, right? But that said, and I think this is a different way to look at qualitative improvement, the number one response actually for 2 years in a row is just improving the reliability of backup. And again, if I use that car example, it'd be like asking somebody why you want to swap out your car, and they say, well, because it breaks down every time I'm trying to drive someplace. Right? If somebody told you that, Jonah, the response would probably be something like, well, then why do you still have that car?
Right.
And so I'm going to ask some of the folks at home, why do you still have that backup? Right? If it's not reliable, then that's the problem. There are a couple other meta themes that we see out of this. Economics fares really heavily into this as well. You see that in the second line on ROI TCO. You see that a couple lines down further on reducing hardware software costs. You see that a couple lines further down again, changing from a CapEx model to an OpEx model. So certainly economics can be about value, ROI. It can be about price, as cost, or it can be about consumption or economic benefit, which is OpEx versus CapEx. But certainly those top drivers are qualitative improvement, better economics, and then I guess if my colleague Dave Russell, he calls this the 4 C's: cost, complexity, capability. And the 4 C that we've added in the last 2 years is cloud, right? You can't have an IT modernization conversation without talking about cloud. Jonah, that's probably why we're talking today, isn't it?
Probably. And I'll say from the service provider standpoint, these numbers definitely align pretty close to my experiences with leads and customers alike.
So Jonah, when you're talking to customers about things like this, what is there's the qualitative problems of my current stuff doesn't work. The other conversation that I typically will hear with the customers that I talk to, I'm curious of your feedback, is whenever they're modernizing some aspect of production, right? So they're going from on-prem Exchange to Office 365. They're going from old physical and virtual to cloud hosted. Whatever that modernization effort is, I often hear that organizations are saying, okay, well, let's start with that workload, because now that we've modernized that workload, our legacy solution doesn't work anymore. It literally doesn't cover that platform. What are you seeing as the top drivers for why organizations are changing?
I'd say in many cases, it's those exact same factors. There's a 2003 or 2008 server that's been retired and replaced
Sure.
with a 2016 or 2019 VM or cloud-based server. There's a hybrid installation of Office 365 and on-prem Exchange while the migration takes place, and they want both sides protected. Or it's even kind of like you said before about the card, just their current solution isn't working for them, and they're hoping to leverage something a little more powerful and reliable.
Sure. If you think about those 4 C's, when we look at, how do we solve for that? For a lot of organizations, and one of the reasons that we are on the call for today is that for a lot of organizations, the way to solve better reliability, to get better outcomes, and arguably to get better economics is to go to cloud-powered backup. So if we go to the other data point that's on our opening slides here, one of the other things that we asked about was whether cloud was part of your data protection solution. So if you can just go to that next slide, Jonah.
Yep.
So in this case, in our DPR 2020 report, we asked organizations what percentage of your data organizations were leveraging the cloud or not. And then we asked them what they thought it was going to be 2 years later, 2022. Similarly, in 2021, this year's report, we asked about what they're currently doing and then what they thought they were going to do in 23. Right? So when you interleave those 4 data points, you get this really lovely curve. And I say that because as a data science type person, I got to tell you, this data is nearly perfect in the line, right? You see that go from 60-40, 66-34, 78-22. That curve is nearly perfect as it goes down through that line. And so I think what I would offer to the folks at home, especially those listening to the recording, is in 2020, about 3 out of 5 organizations had the cloud as part of their data protection strategy. By 2023, and here we are at the end of 21, we're like literally like dotted line right down the middle of your slide, right? By 2023, 4 out of 5, actually slightly better, will be using the cloud as part of their data protection, and 1 out of 5 IT pros will wonder why his boss thinks that they are a legacy administrator and that they need to update their resume. It might not be quite that dire, but this does really show the fact that cloud powered or cloud enabled or enhanced or augmented, whatever fancy adjective you want, really is the inevitable future for most organizations and their data protection strategy. And again, if you want to look at any of the data here more closely, I would refer folks back to the QR code in the upper right-hand corner. You're welcome to download these reports and actually look at the deeper dive into a lot of the data itself. Jonah, when you look at what your customers are doing, obviously, as a cloud provider, you probably only get to talk to those folks that are doing that cloud-based path. Out of curiosity, are most organizations going entirely to cloud-powered, or are they augmenting with some level of on-prem recovery capability before they go to the cloud as their ultimate destination?
I'm seeing a combination of the two. Typically, what we'll see is some on-prem protection, and the cloud is almost kind of like a last resort or tertiary DR side if their on-premises protection fails as well as their production environment.
We often will also see the idea that that for recoveries that are like 7 days old, and yeah, probably on-prem disk works, especially when you have a competent IT staff, which is on-premise. One of the scenarios that I am actually most excited about when Veeam works with partners like Offsite Data Sync is those robo scenarios and distributed environments, especially for large enterprises and upper commercial size accounts, where you've got a lot of remote offices. You have the normal user staff, but you don't have IT expertise. And frankly, if a robo breaks, there's no one in that office that needs the data. It's the company that needs the data. And so I tell all of those organizations, no matter how large of an enterprise, that is a no-brainer scenario for why you should be using cloud-powered data protection, is to move that around. And I think that also affects some of these numbers as well. So if you're looking for this, this is not just an SMB or commercial scenario. This is something that we should be thinking about along the way. Let's go to the next one, because we want to talk about, so we talk about cloud-powered backup, and I'm keen to show the difference between what cloud-powered backup means and what is BaaS, right? So certainly there's a lot of organizations out there, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this after. But Jonah, one thing that I was immediately kind of surprised about was we asked organizations, or the research company asked the organizations, what does BaaS actually mean? What does backup as a service actually mean? Because it can mean a lot of different things to different people. I was surprised by the fact that there's not one definitively authoritative, this is BaaS. And if it looks like this, it's BaaS. And if it doesn't look like this, it's not. We certainly hear that when customers are looking at small backup as a service, purpose-built clouds. That's not the business that Veeam wants to partner with. Veeam wants to partner with folks like ODS as a partner-delivered set of capabilities. But if you look at quintessentially what is the definition, right? So we're looking for the services themselves to run from a cloud, right? We're looking for web-based management, so a better user experience. And then certainly, and in my mind, and it's a little self-serving, that third one around being managed by expertise. I'm a huge fan of VCSPs and managed service providers, because I think what most people don't understand is the power is not in the provider, it's in the service, right? It's in that expertise perspective of what you get in. And Jonah, as one of our Veeam vanguards, you are the pinnacle of that expertise experience. Can you talk a little about what kind of things you offer from a BaaS perspective, and also the expertise that you bring to the party?
Right. As a BaaS offering, we've of course offer backup to our environment, and there's some other functionality for disaster recovery I can go into there. The main benefit, building on what you were talking about, is a lot of our staff are Veeam certified engineers or Veeam certified architects. So besides just a Vanguard, I'm a Veeam certified architect. So between the two, I'm actually in the middle of refreshing my architect certification because the new version just dropped. I'll actually be jumping back into the class here after this webinar. So I'll be learning the latest optimizations and best practices for Veeam. But then as a Vanguard, I, for example, went to Prague for a week back in October and got to sit down directly with Veeam's product management team to provide feedback as a cloud provider on what we'd like to see in upcoming features, what our customers are requesting, and even some roadmaps to have an idea of what's coming in the future so we can begin preparing our environment and services for the latest and greatest Veeam functionality that's coming.
That works for me. By the way, there's a couple things that I should point out. So I got an instant message a few seconds ago, and this was a private message. So let me read it back out for the folks. Notice that tape is the bottom option on this screen. Is tape dead? I love that question, actually. So tape is not dead. Tape is no more dead in 2021 than it was dead in 2011, more than it was dead in 2001, more than it was dead in 1991. And I've been in data protection for 31 years, so I get to poke fun at that. There absolutely is a purpose for tape. There's nothing which is as cheap or as air-gapped as taking a cartridge out of a drive, sticking it on a shelf. I mean, that is truly air-gapped, right? Not including fire and flood. But for most operational recoveries, and because if you look at what are the top three things that BaaS means, BaaS is really around reducing the burden of managing backups and managing the backup server in particular, which is one of the reasons why I like some of the folks over at ODS. right? So we're gonna relieve the burden of babysitting the backups, and then, oh, by the way, then the IT folks can actually do what they want to do. That's really the same benefits that you get out of tape as well, right? So no one wants to say that I don't like tape. What they say is I don't like to manage us taking the tapes out of the drive and then giving to some guy in a white truck to lose my tapes for me. That's what they don't like. So instead, let's get rid of that operational burden instead. So anyway, so that's, by the way, thanks for the question up front. Please feel free to pile on with any other questions. You're welcome to put them straight into the Q&A tab. And Jonah, I will try to cover at least the Veeam ones as we go. But shall we move on?
Yes.
So I guess the last of the pre-prepared slides as far as backup goes. So one of the other questions that was asked of respondents was looking at, so in this particular survey, a little bit different data set, 738 respondents, all of whom were using cloud-powered data protection as part of their IT strategy. One of the things that was asked of those respondents was, why do you use backup as a service instead of, or in complement to, by the way, a traditional backup hardware and software stack? And so, Jonah, I think this is really interesting. So I think you see two kind of meta themes that come out of this. The first one is, if you look furthest to the right, on that right-hand edge, the most common response was simply data survivability, right? So I wrote a book back in 2010, and the first words on the first page and the last words on the last page was, get your data out of the building. Right? Because if you don't get your data out of the building, there's nothing you can do during all these crises. But at least if your data is survivable, you could roll up your sleeves and maybe the business will persevere through this. So certainly data survivability, or the way it's written here, the ability to access those backups from anywhere, is hugely paramount and the most common response. But take a look at some of the other most common responses. If you look at it from an economics perspective, OpEx versus CapEx comes in high, reducing costs. In fact, let's do this. So there's three ways economics fares in. So 17% said the main reason was OpEx versus CapEx. A few down, another 9%, so that's 26 of reducing costs. Another 4% down the way, call that 30. And then leveraging experts and freeing up internal resources, that's another 8%. 38%, my math is right, 38% of organizations said the main reason was due to economic benefit. Now, I want to be clear for the folks at home, that does not mean the cloud is always cheaper. My boss, the CTO, is very quick to tell you the cloud is not a charity, right? What you get is higher value. It's about economic benefit, not necessarily about guaranteed to always be the cheapest thing ever. If you buy the thing that's guaranteed to always be the cheapest thing ever, you get exactly what you paid for. Don't do that. Jonah.
I completely agree with that. I'd say we're seeing an increasing trend on the service provider side where people are utilizing public cloud for some offsite retention, but they're just not quite getting the performance recoverability they're wanting. So they're looking over to us because we might not be quite as cheap as an Azure Blob Storage or a Wasabi repository, but we offer the expertise of our VMCEs and our VMCAs, and plus the added DR functionality.
Yeah, I mean, there are some things that if you're entirely self-managed, there's a place for just a generic Bitbucket to throw stuff to. But really, I think if you start looking at what are those advantages that are recognized by using a managed service provider, it really is. It's around the S. It's around the service and expertise. It is not just about, hey, my data survives. Technically, you can do that in a couple of different ways. The value comes from the expertise. And that's probably a good segue into what kinds of expertise and capabilities is it that ODS provides.
I agree. So ODS, we of course have our off-site storage for you in our data centers in Vegas and Grand Rapids primarily. Anytime you have a DR failure, you can call us up and our support teams will help you through your emergency. We have our online portal, which gives you some greater functionality. So for example, if you're an MSP, you can actually partner with us and you can automatically provision that offsite resources for your end users. Or if you're utilizing Veeam Backup for Microsoft 365 through us, you can perform self-service restores of your organization all through that portal. And then as you get a little more on the DRaaS side rather than the BaaS, there's replication functionality. So there's one-click failovers for both individual machines and a full site failover that includes a public IP with NAT rules that you can pre-configure for your Exchange server or your web servers. And a lot of pre-sales is focused on sitting down with you, your executives, your IT teams, and tailoring the solution to meet both your business and your operational needs and requirements, and making sure that those needs and wants align together.
Tailored is actually something we're going to spend some time on a little bit later in the session, in that I know I happen to have some data slides for that as well. So if you search this on Twitter, you'll usually find this attributed to me. I've been talking about this for a very, very long time. But one of my favorite things, one of these days I'll get someone to make me a poster that I can put behind my wall. But in the meantime, what I will often tell customers is, as you're looking at cloud-powered data protection, I would suggest to you, why BaaS when you can DRaaS, right? So and fundamentally, the concept is pretty similar, right? Either way, you're getting your data out of the building. Either way, you're using a cloud provider. Either way, you've got some expertise there. But that's really where the difference ends. If we kind of go forward to the next piece along, next slide along the way, we did look at where does the cloud fit, not just in operational recovery, but also in disaster recovery, something that's more higher scale, typically has a higher level of complexity. And I would say it this way. When you think about BaaS, you should be thinking about, okay, my primary data is at some location or a cloud like Office 365, Jonah, you mentioned earlier. And then my primary goal is I need to put the data back where it came from, right? So maybe I lost a server, I lost a storage array, maybe I lost a rack, and that's a really bad day, but that's all you get, right? So you put your data back where it came from, or if you've been ransomed, then put a clean data of your data back where it came from, right? That's BaaS. That's very different from, I've lost parts of my infrastructure, I've lost a location, fire, flood, human, whatever the causality is. And now instead of, I don't have a location to go back to, right? I need to actually spin that up within a cloud, because my goal is not put the data back. My goal is get back to work, right? And so that disaster recovery scenario, I think, is much different. As I said, I've been in this business for 31 years. For 9 of those years, I was a certified disaster recovery planner, CDRP. And so I'm really excited about what the future holds from this. Again, we're looking at data from 2 different reports, 2 different years, asking what are you doing today? What are you going to do over 2 years? The next year, do it again, do it again. And that kind of interleaves this out. And what you'll notice is those organizations that are using self-managed multiple data centers. And I'm a fan of that, right? So if you have a data center on the East Coast and the West Coast, and you're replicating between them and then can orchestrate, use Veeam's disaster recovery orchestrator preferably to link those 2 back together again, you get some great outcomes out of that. And on average, about 30% of organizations do that today and expect to continue to do so. Because if you already paid for the secondary data center and infrastructure, you may as well go ahead and use it. But that's what you see on the bottom of that slide: 30%, 28, 33, 32, et cetera. Roughly 3 out of 10 organizations are doing that today. But look where the growth is in disaster recovery, right? In 2020, 23% of organizations were using the cloud as part of their DR strategy. Then that grows to 30%. Next year, it'll go to 38%. Year after that, that grows to 51%. Over double. All right, it actually asserts itself as you pass from 2021 and 22, which is literally right where we are right now. Right. I think there's 2 reasons for that are consistently discussed when I talk to C-level execs. Certainly, one of them is simply having a secondary site. Right. If you're a large enterprise, yeah, you probably have multiple data centers. Do the bottom. Okay, but if you haven't yet, or if you don't have a secondary site, you're a commercial organization, you only have IT personnel at one location, whatever the math for that turns out to be, one of the best parts of any cloud service is the elasticity of it, right? So you have the storage when all the time, but you don't have to pay for compute until you need it. You don't have to pay for networking until you need it. You know when you need it? When the primary site's underwater. Right. So certainly that site access becomes a key capability. But the other thing, and Jonah, I'm going to have to point back to you on this one, is that expertise. As I said, I've been in backup for 31 years. I was in DR for 9 of those years. And the difference is not every backup admin grows into a DR person. That's a very different set of skills in order to walk someone through, hey, my server blew up in Dallas and now I need to power it up in Colorado or Phoenix or Las Vegas or whatever it has to be. That's a different set of plumbing that has to be done. But those two drivers, expertise and secondary site, both of which you only get from a service provider, I think is why we're seeing that huge growth in disaster recovery. Jonah, you've lived and breathed cloud-powered DR for a while. Talk about that evolution and the kinds of stuff that you're doing now.
Everything you said, completely correct. And it's becoming increasingly more important even for small businesses to have as minimal of an outage as possible, which is part of why we're seeing the shift. But another thing that I'm seeing is even the larger enterprises with multiple data centers are leveraging cloud providers as a tertiary location. So God forbid they were ransomed and that ransomware hit both or all of their data centers and their replicas were destroyed too, then they can turn to their cloud provider, which is almost a warm air gap solution that would protect them from an incident like that.
I would agree with that. I would also point out the fact that, if you had two data centers that are both shiny and new, then bringing all the data from the remote offices back into one or two of those data centers makes sense. As that hardware comes off of warranty, as that storage becomes more and more antiquated, then the data center, especially the centralized data center, becomes less and less adequate to be the DR of those remote locations. So again, I'm a huge fan even of large enterprises leveraging the elasticity of cloud, because frankly, modernization of the infrastructure and making sure you have enough bandwidth and capability, that becomes ODS's problem.
Yep.
The subscriber's problem. And if I'm an operational CIO, that matters, right? So certainly, yeah. So elasticity, I think, comes into that as well. In my mind, I'm excited about this, especially for those organizations that before did not have the expertise, did not have the secondary site. For them, and Jonah, you brought it up, small and mid-sized businesses, they are just as dependent on their data as the largest of enterprises. They just don't have a Clark Kent on staff that can jump into a phone booth, become Superman, and go fix their problems. They need that expertise that's not on the payroll. So we see that's very much inevitable from that perspective. Now, that said, let's go back to the data for a second, because this shows the trend lines along the way. Remember, we talked earlier about how when organizations were asked about BaaS, we asked, why do you use BaaS instead of a self-managed backup stack? Let's look now at why organizations use DRaaS as opposed to a secondary data center. And I think what you'll see here is there's a much broader set of recognizable value than just survivability of data and economics, right? If you look on that far right-hand edge, it's statistically near a six-way tie. 674, you get about 2.5 points of variance on a 6-point scale. So those 6 on the right are nearly flat, right? Certainly freeing up IT resources, right? Instead of that secondary data center, that's part of the question. But take a look at all those 36s, 38s, and 39s, right? Cost efficiency, resource sharing. Again, expertise from that service provider staff. Organizations leveraging a cloud-first mantra from executive leadership. And I would also tell you those bottom two from the high points, the 38% adhering to compliance regulations. So that goes back to get your data out of the building. And a guarantee of SLA if you're in financial or healthcare organizations, as an example. And then reducing complexity, because a server that goes down in Dallas and wakes up in Colorado, that's more than a hat trick to get the users back connected to that again. You need a round of expertise that is few and far between. So that's why we see that from a data perspective. Jonah, when you're talking with offsite data sync customers about why they're either adding cloud instead of their secondary data center or in complement to, what are the conversations that you and ODS have?
A lot of it is that expertise, the testing functionality that we offer twice a year, and then at least for the Cloud Connect backup side, because we do offer DR for both backup and replication Veeam products, it's the cost efficiency and resource sharing, because for a dedicated data center in many cases, or even for replication, you have to have one-to-one hardware in order to maintain replica VMs. And with something like Cloud Connect Backup that has DR functionality, you don't necessarily need that. Your service provider can have a dedicated DR cluster in every data center, yes, but in all likelihood, they're not going to have every single one of their customers spin up at once. So they can maintain a slightly smaller environment, which works out to typically a lower cost for you. And because it's the shared resources that are used mainly for DR and tests, it's also easier for them to maintain and upgrade that hardware like you were discussing earlier.
Makes sense, makes sense. So let's talk more about that expertise. So the next question that was asked in the survey instrument was really looking at the kinds of services, which is another way of translating expertise, that was provided for. And you actually see two colored bands of different services that were provided for this. So if you look on the top, you see what I think of as the operational demands, right? So you see monitoring the job, you see capacity planning, managing the repositories, architecture. The color coding was added afterwards, but you see all of the, what I would call the strategic consultancy on the bottom. Joan, I have to admit, when I first saw this data, I was a little disappointed, right? Because what I thought about was, well, I wish it was inverted, right? I wish that what you really got was all of that BCDR acumen, and then down from there. But if I'm honest about it, the bottom line is, I think a lot of people think about these kinds of questions and think about, well, there's the have tos and the want tos. And I would tell you that there is the have tos, the need tos, and the want tos. And in this case, there is no point in getting BCDR consultancy if you don't have jobs that reliably function, if the repositories are not well curated, if the architecture is not well maintained and scaled correctly. So while I would have originally liked these to be flipped, I actually think it's interesting that really it still comes down to, I want to relieve that operational burden. And now, and only because I've relieved that operational burden, I can count on my data being survivable. Now let's talk about the competencies that are there. Ooh, actually, we got a question on this one. So how can I make sure I align my recovery goals and service expectations? Let me start off, but then let's hear from you on this one. So from my perspective, the conversation I typically have with C-levels is it starts with making sure that you line up the business requirements with the technology capabilities, right? So how much data loss you can afford, how much downtime you can afford truly is dependent on the business unit, on the application stacks, and what your business process is to understand what the IT dependencies are. But then once you do that, then you can have an honest conversation on then aligning those IT requirements with what a service provider can offer. Jonah, this is often when you get into the story, isn't it?
It is. It very much is. It's how do we make those goals align? How do we make them a reality? And especially so on the technical side, because I tend to come in kind of on the back end of the C-levels talking to sales and more as the technical people start to come in. So I'm a little bit in both of the worlds and kind of making them talk to each other, making sure that both of them can accomplish what they need and want. Because sometimes meeting a business requirement that a C-level wants is extremely technical for the people that are the boots on the ground. And it takes a little more than the C-level can realize, or it might take a little more cost than the technical people realize. So it's also to an extent helping them go through some cost benefit analysis of what can they afford, what would they get for what they can afford, and how much are they willing to spend versus cut back, and what risks do they incur by cutting back where they cut back.
So that makes sense to me. Often, when I first start having conversations, especially when we talk about Veeam, and Veeam will do backup recovery, backup usually being done as a nightly function. We do replication, right? So now you're shrinking that down to minutes or hours. We will manage your snapshots for you. So now you're in that sub-minute range. And then in the last year, Veeam's also added continuous data protection, CDP. And so again, it's kind of like, grandfather, father, son. Now you're down to grandfather, father, son, puppy, and it's plushy toy. I mean, we just keep refining down that data loss. And when you tell a customer about that, they come back and say, well, I want the best. And then you say, great, here's the price tag for the best. And they go, well, right? So there's a difference between that expectation and then what actually makes sense to the business. That's where we come back to, talk to me about what your costs of downtime and data loss are. And then let me defer you to somebody who can actually help architect a solution that lines up with that cost. Cost of solution should never exceed cost of problem. That's a conversation I've had on more than one whiteboard. But Jonah, you've brought up a slide on DRaaS. I'm assuming these are the ODS offerings.
Correct. Kind of to what you were saying, though, in many cases, what we'll find is, like you said, the customer wants Cloud Connect replication, but it's not necessarily beneficial to them for the cost. So typically what we'll see is a combination of Cloud Connect replication and Cloud Connect backup with them, wherein we'll see their tier 1, maybe tier 2 applications on both products, and I'll get back to that in a moment. And then they're kind of tier 3 and less needed VMs on their Cloud Connect backup. And the reason I say we pair both for the tier 1 and tier 2 is because hypothetically, there are some ransomware strains out there that will sit for days, weeks, even months potentially. Sure. Now. So, and replication tends to be much, because of the lower RTPO, it tends to be a much shorter retention period, in a couple days, maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks, if you're extremely lucky. So if you were to see some sort of malware infection that hit you before the replication took place, you could at least still have the Cloud Connect backups to utilize for your recovery.
Yep.
But replication is nice because, like you said, it's all snapshot based. Therefore, from our side, it's a much faster recovery for you to get the environment up. But there's some additional functionality in there with partial site failover and full site failover, wherein if you're utilizing replication and one of your servers goes down while you rebuild it on premises, you can perform a partial site failover leveraging Veeam's network extension appliances, which will actually perform layer 2 routing and let your production environment talk to the replica in our DR environment. Or there's a full site failover, which utilizes a pre-configured failover plan to perform kind of like what I discussed earlier, the automatic failover to our environment with the NAT statement. So if you had an Exchange server with a 1-hour TTL on the DNS, you could perform a full site failover, take the public IP we've assigned you, repoint your DNS to it, and within an hour you can be set up. And there's also much easier failback functionality than with Cloud Connect backup. But of course, that all, like you said, does come at a premium because there's the dedicated hardware needed for that to maintain the replica VMs and the snapshots.
So what I love about what you said was, and remember we talked earlier about how making sure you first align what are the business goals, right? So first you establish what are the downtime and loss tolerances of an organization. Those are business requirements. Then lining that up and understanding what the IT dependencies are from that. And then from there, it's about making good on the goals. Right. So then lining that up. But I like how you describe several different ways that based on what level of IT dependency and IT resiliency is necessary, ransomware looks different in your example than, say, fire and flood. Right. When you have fire and flood, and this is something that, sometimes folks miss in the details, when you talk about things like fire and flood in the traditional disaster recovery scenarios, your goal is always near zero replication. How fast can I get that most recent version of the data up and running again? And that is exactly not the copy that you want in a cyber attack, right? The copy that's 3 minutes old is nearly guaranteed to be just as infected as the copy that you just discovered, right? So really what you want to be able to do is, but there's a different level of consultancy that comes out of remediating from a ransomware crisis. There's also different kinds of crises when you think about a site level crisis, because, and this is an example I learned many, many years ago, perhaps, but certainly well before you were involved in IT, Jonah. I remember going to, I was at a DR event and we were talking about floods was the most common scenario. So you've got this major data center. I live in Dallas, Texas, and while Dallas isn't prevalent for floods, Houston certainly is, about 3.5 hours south from here. And what would often happen is you get these floods in Houston and the data center would go underwater. Great. So now we got to go ahead and solve everything. And then what they figured out was the IT staff, they're still around, but they didn't show up for work the next day. Right. The reason they didn't show up for work the next day is because if the data center downtown was flooded, their living room was probably flooded at home. And I guarantee I report to my chief spousal officer more than I report to anybody else. And so I'm bailing water out of my living room and the data center is just going to have to wait. And so what can you do when you have a site level crisis? Well, it'd sure be nice if you could call some folks that weren't as invested, maybe be geographically separated, who could keep starting those recovery buttons for you. Because your own IT staff is temporarily unavailable. So don't diminish that part of it as well. Certainly, that's another part of the service. Jonah, let's talk about that service provider angle for a little bit. I've got just two more data points that I want to share with the folks in the call for today. The first one is organizations were actually asked, why did you choose yours, right? So there's a buyer's journey. First, we started talking about, okay, we have to solve for better backup. One way you can do that and better economics is by leveraging a service provider to give you better outcomes, likely better economic benefits. Okay, so now we're down the path of going towards managed services for data protection. Then we get to go down the path of, okay, so we're just talking about BaaS or DRaaS. We talked about some of the differentiators for that. Once you get that far down the path, it's kind of like saying, hey, okay, I've decided I want a new house. And now I've decided how many bedrooms I need. And I've decided what neighborhood. There is a buyer's journey that happens. But at some point, you're faced with a couple options, right? Truth be told, Offsite Data Sync is not the only managed service provider on the face of the earth. There are more than one. Only other couple that are interesting, but there is more than one. So then the question becomes, how did you choose your service provider? So in this case, 739 IT leaders all using data protection as a service. Some of them statistically were Veeam customers, a couple were probably ODS maybe. But they were asked, how did you choose your service provider? The color coding was added after the fact just because the bands look so simple. Let's go ahead and light up those bands for a second because I think it tells a really interesting story. First and foremost, in the same way that as a IT leader or a curator of any amount of data, my primary concern, especially in 2021, leading into 2022, is around data security. So it might be counterintuitive. For as long as I've been in this business, organizations says, well, you don't want a cloud because if you put your stuff in a cloud, I mean, everybody could get to it, right? And that has always been the naysayers' comment on any as a service offering. But I have to tell you, for as long as I've been in this industry, most cloud architectures are inarguably more secure than the on-premise legacy backup that you are probably replacing it with. Right? Most on-prem backup solutions do not encrypt at rest. Most on-prem backup solutions do not encrypt in flight. Most on-prem backup solutions, many of them don't do role-based access, right? So all of those things you actually get with the cloud architecture. But that said, you should be, and I'm talking without ODS at this point, you should be talking to your service provider about, how does they ensure the security of your data? And then the other scenarios that come after that, let's look at quality of experience. If you're going to outsource, if you're going to partner with somebody, make sure it's somebody who's pleasant, right? Make sure it's somebody whom you can trust. Make sure that it's somebody who you actually don't mind doing business with. Jonah, I'm looking on the back of your wall, so it looks like you'd be trustworthy, loyal, kind, friendly, helpful, courteous. Make sure it's someone who's worth doing business with, right? Next behind that, solution capabilities. So after you know that your data is secure and you don't mind doing business with those humans, then the next question that comes up is, do I actually get what I need from an IT delivery perspective? Do I actually get those quality experiences? So that means the capabilities defined by the software, the capabilities defined by the service provider's infrastructure and stack, their accessibility, geolocality, all of those kinds of things kind of come into fray. And then only after my data is secure, I don't mind doing business with them, and I know I'm going to get what I need, then there's that last part of the buyer's journey, which is, oh, by the way, is it economically superior as a set of offerings? So that's what the data shows as far as what's driving that. My guess is there's probably at least one ODS sales guy on this call, and they're probably eager and anxious to talk to you after this about these kinds of tenets and how that relates to ODS. But Jonah, when you're in those conversations with your customers, or even more with ODS prospects, and they're talking about, help us understand the ODS advantage or the ODS capability stack, how does ODS answer questions like these?
Data security, fairly simple thanks to some built-in Veeam functionality. You have insider protection as an option for what we call your warm storage, which are your more accessible backups, which means that if malware or a malicious actor or even a disgruntled ex-employee goes into your Veeam server and deletes your cloud backups, because we are seeing malware start to do that these days, it'll go to a Veeam recycle bin and still be accessible for restore functionality. And for what we call our archive tier or our cold storage, which is object storage, we have immutability as an option.
All right. Yep.
As well to help protect against that. Quality of experience, beyond just having our dedicated support teams, our VMCEs and VMCAs, who part of the courses are to go through reading Veeam logs and troubleshooting yourself before you engage Veeam support. We have relationships with Veeam as evidenced by us doing this webinar together, but beyond that, we have a dedicated support manager in the Veeam support queue. We have monthly cadence calls with Veeam people on what issues are we seeing with Veeam, are our customers seeing, what are some hot fixes and registry tweaks that are being recommended to providers that are new for both use in our environment and our customers' environments. There's the Partner Advisory Council, and of course, my relationship with other vanguards, where we have dedicated Slack channels, not just for Veeam related topics, but a dedicated channel for service providers to discuss our needs, frustrations, or anything else we may discover that could benefit others.
Makes sense. Now, we actually did have a question that comes in, and I'm thinking this one's more for you than me. It says, I am an MSP. How can I leverage Veeam and ODS capabilities for my end users? Certainly, ODS is our partner, but you service partners directly too, don't you?
We do. So like I mentioned earlier, we do have our cloud portal. So if you're an MSP, you can partner with us and you can automatically provision backup and replication resources for your customers. And I believe Office 365 as well. Beyond that, we offer, of course, the offsite spin up, which in many cases with MSPs, they tend to be working with small to mid-sized businesses who don't have those secondary data centers. So we serve as a great secondary location for them. And that's really the biggest benefit is we have some great partner relationships with MSPs and Veeam accredited service partners.
So let's talk about that one for a second, the VASP side of things as a service partner. So let's take a look at the last piece of data for the charts for today, because one of the other things we wanted to do from a myth busting perspective was looking at what is the preferred experience from a service provider. So if you can imagine, the research company that we use asked 1,000 organizations on this question. They said, are you looking for IT to still run everything? You just want it to not be babysat, or do you want it on the other end? I want that true turnkey, white glove concierge. Every time I pick up the phone, you're just going to solve it all for me, and I'm out of the backup business, right? Those are the two extremes of that, and there's actually some variance in between, right? And that's what you're looking at on the left-hand side of the slide. And I was admittedly kind of surprised because I'm a big fan of white gloved experience. I'm a big fan of, look, I not only want the people I'm working with to be smarter than me, I really want to offload as much of that daily experience as possible. But in fact, 63%, so let's call that 5 out of 8 organizations actually still plan on IT leading most of the kinds of activities that are out there. Whereas 13%, if you're looking on the left-hand side, but on the bottom, 1 out of 8 organizations, no, I really want that MSP to take over most of it for me. Now you'll notice there's this big obnoxious yellow block right in the middle. 1 out of 4 organizations, they answered, it depends. Maybe, I don't know yet, the neutral. So what we did with the data, it's the same question on the right-hand side of the slide and the left-hand side. What we did was we got rid of the yellow, right? So it's kind of like me saying, look, you can have chocolate ice cream, you can have vanilla ice cream. The swirl is broken. You don't get the swirl, you got to choose, right? And so we got rid of the you can choose. And so when you reweight the data, that's how we got rid of the yellow in the middle. The other thing was this particular survey was asked of small and mid-sized organizations, so organizations under 250 employees. It was asked of what Veeam would call a commercial organization, typically 250 through 1,000 employees. And then what we would call an enterprise of 1,000 employees or more, right? So we got rid of the neutral, the swirl, and then we cut it by the 3 industry sizes. And I got to tell you, a little bit more myth busting. You could have said, well, enterprises, they have experts, they do it all themselves. They just want a cloud bucket, right? They want to manage it their own way. Or you could have said SMBs, no, they want the low budget version because they can't afford budget. Both of those myths are untrue. Turns out, regardless of industry size, looking on that right-hand side, somewhere between 15 and 19, split the difference, call it 16, 1 in 6. 1 in 6 organizations really want that premium, turnkey, white glove, concierge, solve my problem for me. And then 5 out of 6 organizations, the rest, are saying, look, I still want to drive everything. I just don't want to babysit it. How does that compare with the types of services and responsiveness that ODS offers to your breadth of customers?
It aligns pretty closely. Typically what we'll see is we'll help with the initial onboarding, we'll help them get it all set up, and then for the most part, once the IT staff on premises has an idea of how to use things, they will typically drive the bus themselves, occasionally bringing myself or another architect back in just to discuss some optimizations or any new Veeam functionality they may have missed out on. Because, for example, when Veeam 10 and Veeam 11 both dropped, we received 30-page documents from Veeam with over 200 new features and enhancements and performance tweaks in each release. And part of being a service provider is we go through, we read that to determine how it affects us, how it affects our customers, how we can leverage those changes. And for a dedicated IT staff on premises, it can be extremely challenging to keep up with that, plus any changes that may be coming for any other products or applications they support on premises.
That brings up a really interesting point, especially when you think about all the innovations that Veeam does that are, say, specific to Pure or NetApp or HPE. You know, we started talking about integrations along the way. One of the things, so I started out my career as a 20-something at a channel partner, right? And as much as I would have loved to have been a vendor SE from day one, what I actually found is that one of the best parts of that local partner, that local provider, is you become an extension of that IT team, right? You are that trusted adjacent counsel, if you will. And so when new products like V11 or V11A, whatever comes after V11, you can use your imagination. Whenever those capabilities come out, we don't know how every customer is using that. We don't know where there are scenarios where you would have liked to have done something, and now this new version comes out that enables that. The partner is that empathetic, boots on the ground consult that can then say, hey, these things will benefit you. Let's turn them on. And something that, frankly, without trusted partners and expertise, many customers would not be using half of the features that they paid for because they just didn't know that they got turned on along the way. And so certainly that trusted partner becomes hugely important overall in the process. What's your response as that trusted partner offer? And I am cheating. I'll look at the next slide to kind of finish this out.
My response, and this is not necessarily true of just us in many of these cases, but there are other companies out there, whether they be other service providers or even companies dedicated to offering you these professional services, is you want someone with experience and expertise. And especially in the cloud service provider offering and the accredited service partner offering, there are requirements to make those directories where you have to maintain a certain number of Veeam certified engineers and Veeam certified architects. And for the accredited service partner side as well, it goes beyond that, and there's requirements for certifications for Hyper-V, VMware, GCP, AWS, and Azure that have to be maintained. So on the ODS side, we've been Partner of the Year 3 times among cloud providers, meaning we've been recognized for outstanding performance, as well as, I believe, once upon a time earning a Veeam Innovation Award for some of our technologies. We have 20 plus years of data protection under our belt, with hundreds upon thousands of VMs protected globally, to the point that I don't even know the number off the top of my head. But it's quite a number, because I know some of our customers alone send us several hundred VMs. Yep. Our data centers are extremely well protected and meet many, many compliance regulations, as you can see on the screen. And besides just the cloud offerings, like I said, we do offer some professional services. So regardless of whether you're utilizing a cloud provider or not, whether you want a cloud provider or not, we can still help you, as can many other accredited service partners. Innovative, I probably should have saved the Veeam Innovation Award for, but
And by the way, you've actually earned 2 of them in the last 5 years.
Look at that, 2 of them.
I happen to run that program, so I'm kind of familiar with that. But hey, Jonah, we've got about 2 minutes left. Not to cut you off, but I know we want to make sure that we get a chance for any last questions that are out there. Veeam runs a weekly live stream called Industry Insights, where me and another former analyst now at Veeam in the office of CTO, we talk through those. So these are our 22 predictions around needing better backups and faster and using the cloud. Let's go to that next one though, because as we talked with organizations about where we saw the meta themes going, here's I think some, let's talk about this as homework. You know, we've got just a few weeks left in 2021. So as organizations are getting ready, let me just offer, this is what Veeam is suggesting. This was from our live stream a few weeks ago, but I thought it was fun for today. Certainly the number one suggestion that we're making to organizations of all sizes is, if you're not already leveraging cloud repositories as part of your data protection that are outside of your primary domain. One, it gives you data survivability, also does give you extra layers of either immutability, air gapping, or both. Certainly that's a big deal. Try a DRaaS service, right? So it's one thing to do BaaS. Why BaaS when you can DRaaS? Take a look at that. Third, don't underestimate Office 365. The recycle bin is a lovely thing for exactly 6 days. And past that, it's as if you just deleted your data. So do not rely on the native durability of the service, right? Do not rely on just the recycle bin. It's still your data. You still got to back that up. Also, as you start looking for things like Amazon RDS, when you're looking at Azure SQL, those kind of things, when you're looking at production databases, make sure you're protecting those. And then lastly, for all the on-premise data center peeps that are out there, you know, be thinking about Sure Backup as a way to confirm your backups are valid. Be thinking about, I would tell you that if you're only using Veeam backup and replication on premises, and you're not also using Veeam One monitoring or Veeam Orchestrator, it's like having a burger without the fries and the drink, right? You really are missing that happy meal kind of thing. But with that in mind, my clock says the big hand's almost on the 12. You got a thank you slide for follow-ups and last details?
I do, and I also have a quick summary with some QR codes. I'll leave that up for a few seconds here. So in case anyone wants to pull up any of the reports, this will also be accessible on the recording. So you can go ahead and pause it, scan the codes.
Yep.
But yes, then we have this wonderful thank you slide with some contact information in case you want to learn a little bit more about all of this from ODS.
Well, Jonah, thank you for having me out today. I hope folks got some insights out of this. By the way, if anyone has any questions about the research itself, you're welcome to contact me at strategic research, all one word, strategicresearch@veeam.com. For everything else, go contact my friends at Offsite Data Sync. Thanks, Jonah.
It's been a pleasure having you, Jason.